The Art of Lucid Dreaming Episode 3. Photographs, text, and podcast created by Jack Lamb. Copyright 2026 John S. Lamb. All rights reserved. Observations about the nature of consciousness. Contemplating more serious lucid dreams. Our truest life is when we are in dreams awake. Henry David Thoreau. We are more curious about the meaning of dreams than about things we see when awake. Diogenes. Crazy Horse dreamed and went into the world where there is nothing but the spirits of all things. That is the real world that is behind this one, and everything we see here is something like a shadow from that one. Black Elk. I don't paint dreams or nightmares, I paint my own reality. Frida Kahlo. Judge of your natural character by what you do in your dreams. Ralph Waldo Emerson. The virtuous man contents himself with dreaming that which the wicked man does in actual life. Sigmund Freud. We have forgotten the age-old fact that God speaks chiefly through dreams and visions. C.G. Jung. A lucid dream in despair of consciousness. On a night no different from any other, I precipitously plunged into a lucid dream as soon as I went to sleep, which turned out to be a desolate vision exposing the plight of all conscious beings. In my dream I saw the universe and all conscious entities within it, moving in disorder, forsaken in the whipping waves and roiling currents of an animated dance of entropy. No one was satisfied with being aware, and so persistently kept moving in the never-ending pursuit of something unseen. When every conscious entity animated within reality, each triggered repercussive subsequent suffering. Worse yet, their frantic animations affected the greatest anguish for beings closest to them, who in turn moved in response, causing greater misery for those in proximity. No matter where I gazed within the matrix of reality, all beings paid the price of pain and despair for their dogged animations. In the dream I abstracted how similar to the myth of the sun god Ra, the cosmological root of this chaos originated when the singularity of consciousness, once unified and extant, shattered into infinite disparate fragments, spawning life with the sparks of animating particularity, now capable of influencing reality on their own to manifest existentiality. These incongruent animations generated new realities of dimensionality and temporality in their wakes, resulting from their frenzied longing to return to the oneness of the integrated unanimity. And from my omniscient perch of perceptivity, it seemed such a reintegration would never manifest while consciousness operated indiscriminately. During this waking lucid dream, I was synchronously aware of consciousness in tangible and paraconscious states, extending awareness so transparently, it covered actuality like a diaphanous shroud. Peculiarly, I believed through force of will alone, I might ordain existential change to alleviate the world's suffering. But when I attempted to implement a subterfuge to conciliate the congregation of anxious spirits, I learned I could do nothing to transform their condition while I suffered the same despair, causing me likewise to animate within this senseless disparity. Oddly, my dreaming par-consciousness was not limited to the present, for I could see every prospective future leading from any course of action I could envision which might stop the suffering. But every future timeline inevitably fostered an evil no less absurd than the desolation I saw before me, spawning more misery in recurrent waves. Ultimately, the vast preponderance of consciousness existing within the multiverse seems unable to get it right when it manifests a reality, and from time immemorial, it persists in manifesting states where abject suffering is the primary occupation of all conscious beings. Movement, or more precisely agitated animation, invariably leads to distress. Plainly, this is how actuality must function until consciousness ultimately apprehends how to get it right. With the future laid before me in this lucid dream, I comprehended if I imposed any change leading to further movements, then the suffering remained or got worse. Because I could no longer repudiate its existence, I reluctantly looked at the only course of action with a chance in hell of succeeding. The obvious way to interrupt the anguish was to stop the animation, or at least stop the acuity of movement in the churning sea of consciousness arrayed before me. So using an understanding welling up within me but until now I refused to acknowledge, I knew I could apply my consciousness to everything within existence using assimilation to quiet the agitated animations. And after pacifying all the fragments yearning to return to the wholeness of the unanimity, I would use any ego left to me, to bring about my own demise consciously. Thus, the entropic mayhem of animated movement would cease once the stigmata spawning the infinities of conspicuous realities was healed. For I knew it as consciousness itself generating the suffering plaguing all of creation. If I succeeded in quieting the animation, existentiality might return to its prototypic order of pacific congruence. And if I failed, then at least my own consciousness would no longer perceive the suffering. Perchance the misery would not be as great if my unimportant portion of particulate perception was no longer here to evidence the cosmological travesty. Nifty stratagem, right? It never worked because my own consciousness revolted at the pretense of instigating dissolution, as clearly this was more responsibility than I cared to assume. Hundreds of ways to die appeared to me in my dream, but since each necessitated a violent manifestation of some kind, I grimly refused to consider any of them viable. For any abhorrent act only feeds the beast, and thereby inflicts more suffering on the world. The masses of consciousness in my vision seemed to become even more agitatedly animated at my reluctance to take responsibility for so insignificant a change to the universal status quo. But even if I willingly could never allow my consciousness to cease, I nevertheless could initiate a less permanent transmogrification by suspending my awareness of self and effecting a transitory state of non-resistance. After all, it's as good a day to die as any. I mused a timeless instant before my world precipitously stopped. When I awakened and became aware of self again and understood I inexplicably still possessed consciousness, I simply accepted it. Nevertheless, I ruefully realized I practically allowed myself to perish in my youthful recklessness to believe I could conceptually bite off more than I was prepared to chew, let alone swallow. And even if my notion on why life exists was equivocally accurate, my Spartan solution to contemplate the cessation of excitation echoed in the need of consciousness to effect movement and animation in its search for reintegration was unarguably anathema. That said, I still believed a sufficiently expanded state of consciousness might effect a constructive alteration in the way reality manifests, for after all, I did have limited success in motivating assimilated change without undue perturbations, proving consciousness could manifest realities without promulgating suffering in its wake. Yet, I could not deny the logic of Lao Tse, who said, "There would be no mountains if there were no valleys to define the distinction of height, because the concept has no meaning without the opposing concept of depth." Just so, it seems unalterable the conceptualization of serenity and contentment must always necessarily generate the contrary conditionalities of suffering and pain. This ultimately is the paradox of morality, as the state of being good, which we believe an objective worthy of attainment, necessitates the manifestation of the opposite state of being evil. Still, as I was shaking off the grogginess of the protracted lucid dream, I flashed on the amorality of creativity as evinced in photography. For, capturing an image of the wonderment and exclusivity of any aspect of the world is a creative act outside the purview of moralistic labels. My Shadowhunter lucid dream. The following lucid dream, which I have named Shadowhunter, is undoubtedly one of the most bizarre dreams I have ever dreamt. Immediately I found myself in a jungle environment, surrounded by trees with huge girths which clearly had never been cut down or clear-cut. Peculiar for a lucid dream, from its outset I recalled not only who the host body I now inhabited was, and therefore, in every detail and respect the role I was expected to play in this world. I also remembered the names of the villagers populating the dream gestalt, all of whom I had known throughout my life, or more accurately, the life of the host body I now tenanted. Mystifyingly, in addition, I discovered that when I thought about it, I also knew the historical records of his village, passed down orally in story and song for untold generations extending to times primordial. Hence, I knew literally everything about my host's world. In this dream I had a family, a wife and 2 children in a dream world where I held considerable authority as the leader of a professional order of Shadowhunter families, dedicated to protecting our village from the shadows spontaneously manifesting to plague all living beings. Shadows were semi-conscious voracious entities spawned in presumably an alternate dimension, which inexplicably materialized in a vast circular cavern near my village, intent on hunting people. Although disoriented upon materialization, after a shadow adjusted to existing in this reality, it forayed from the cave to track, hunt and catch solitary villagers, stripping them of select sets of their lifespan memory threads extending through their pasts, presents, and futures. As shadow hunters, we daily swept the cavern for newly materialized shadows in order to catch them first, an act that not only obliterated the demon, but also released the memory threads it earlier consumed, thereby returning memories to those to whom they belonged. It was not an overly dangerous task because shadows required several hours to become sufficiently mobile to hunt and catch memories outside the cavern. And since until then, they were lethargically slow, it was easy to catch them before they caught one of us. However, once a shadow exited the cavern, they were impossible to see, and extremely difficult to catch. Akin to the analogy of two children playing tag, the corporeal act of catching a shadow was restrictively circumscribed. Despite the fact both players come into physical contact when a tag is made, each player always knows who did the tagging and who was tagged. Just so, this same surety of intent determined whether a shadow stole a hunter's memory thread or a hunter slayed a shadow and thereby recovered stolen memories. It may seem strange that I arrived in the aboriginal world of this lucid dream reality with my cognizance crammed full of the pre-knowledge I would need to move among the villagers without drawing attention. For without it, I would have acted like the proverbial bull in a china shop. But rather than shattering china, I certainly would have broken a taboo anathema to the villagers. So whatever the purpose of this lucid dream might be, it would never be resolved unless I used the memories of my host body to perform the tasks my host would normally perform. And more importantly, behave and speak to my host's family, my host's fellow shadow hunters, and all the villagers just as my host would have done. Consequently, I resolved to live the life of my host for as long as it might take. And after a short night sleeping huddled with my family beneath tanned and chewed animal hides arranged around the fire ring in our hut, the following day I performed the duties expected of me, hunting for game, making minor repairs to a few huts, and shadow hunting each afternoon. Repeating this mundane regimen each of the next 3 days of elapsed dream time, I began to worry. For one thing, sleeping in a lucid dream is problematic. Because the possibility of entering a secondary lucid dream while already immersed in a primary lucid dream could cause me to awaken in my normal waking life reality, rather than in this primary, Paleolithic lucid dream. Maintaining a feathered control over my progression of awakening in nested levels of lucid dreams could be tricky. In my experience, I had never spent more than 4 dream days and nights in any lucid dream. So it was possible this was an actual limit I could not supersede. It is extremely rare to sleep in any dream, let alone lose consciousness for an extended and unknown interval of time. And rarer still to awaken, incontestably still dreaming. But to fall asleep multiple times, and find myself still entrenched within a remembered contiguous lucid dream, is a chilling and unsettling experience. When I last slept in a dream, for consecutive nights in all, after awakening from my final night's sleep I barely remembered I was trapped in a lucid dream. And the directed causality of my recollections, ostensibly promulgating into my future towards the manifestation of my intent, seemed no more than the recalled pages of a book I read so long ago I barely remembered its plotline. So based on this precedent, I had to awaken from this dream before I slept another night. A luminescent fungus intermittently grew on the ceiling of the large cavern chamber where the shadows spawned, thereby illuminating the otherwise dark space. Since the floor was relatively flat, we shadow hunters patrolled the chamber on sleds, which moved 2 or 3 times faster than the other materialized shadows, so it was exceedingly rare for a newling shadow to catch a hunter. Although known as sleds, these anti-gravity platforms had no runners or rails. Nevertheless, they allowed a single hunter to skim above the cavern's sandy floor at a faster speed than the shadows could travel. Each family hunted as a team, so while 4 men patrolled the chamber on sleds, the women and children guarded the entrance to catch any shadows that tried to leave the cave. Since the sight of the jungle scenery outside the cavern temporarily froze a fleeing shadow, it allowed our youngsters to become proficient at hunting shadows without putting themselves in peril. And even if the shadow managed to catch a child, it was virtually impossible for it to escape the other family members guarding the entrance, who quickly caught it in turn and released the stolen memories of the juvenile. In my lucid dream while off duty, I received word a new kind of shadow attacked the family patrolling the cavern. The child caught by this shadow had been stripped of memories in his entirety, and thus his consciousness effectively ceased to exist, leaving behind a comatose shell. The boy's father had thus far been unable to catch this aberrant shadow to restore his son's memories because it inexplicably moved faster than his sled's top speed. This was something which had never transpired in the archetypal recollections of the village, and thus ominously presaged a dangerous threat to our future. So, quickly gathering my wife and children, we hurried to the cavern to try to catch this extremely skilled shadow before it escaped into the jungle. I circled the chamber many times on my sled without seeing the shadow. Then a scream of desolation at the entrance caused me to change my path and track a direct course across the circular space towards my wife's cry. There, I learned that a shadow she named an abomination had caught her and stripped her of a predestined reality of the child she would have birthed several years hence. She only recognized her lost future by the void it left in her recollected past and present, which removed all causal occurrences which would have led to the birth. And although my children were also loath to describe this shadow, they said it had not escaped the cavern, so I hastily resumed my circular patrol. With my need to catch this uber shadow all the greater, it frustrated me when I saw no sign of it, even though I orbited the chamber several dozen times in succession. Then suddenly sensing its presence, I turned to discover the shadow rapidly coming up from behind trying to catch me. For a shadow to move so fast was unheard of, and as there was nothing I could do to speed up my sled, the shadow inexorably gained on me. And only when it drew dangerously near, did I see the dog it held by a leash propelling it forward faster than my sled could slide. I thought of it as a dog only because it was leashed, but in truth, the amorphous malevolence pulling the shadow forward had more in common with a flaming hound of hell than it did with any actual creature. Finally, the shadow and its hound pulled within 6 feet of me. And I was sure it shortly would strip me of my memories. But somehow, I managed to stay just out of its reach for another 2 revolutions of the chamber. I assumed I awakened in my bed because of my level of anxiety over the welfare of my family waiting helpless at the cavern's mouth. But as I lay there remembering my lucid dream, it occurred to me that perhaps the shadow caught me after all. And once stripped of my memories, past, present and future, I awakened because I no longer existed in that bizarre dream world. Confronting a wrathful God in a lucid dream. One night when I assumed I would never be able to sleep, let alone dream, I lucidly dreamed about a startling encounter with a wrathful God. The dream took place in an older building I believed to be the house my cousins lived in as children. Even though I subconsciously knew it had nothing in common with their home. 4. Whereas the country house with exposed 12-inch square beams they grew up in had originally been built in 1829 as a barn, this dream reality house and its accoutrements seemed fashioned in 16th century France. Oddly, it was occupied by virtually every person I ever called friend or loved in my life. No matter what room I entered, several people I knew were present, absorbedly going about their business with their usual degree of attentiveness as per my recollection of their behaviors. With steadfast, albeit indeterminate purpose, I moved among them towards an unknown end, leisurely stopping when accosted to say hello to each person I had not seen for many years. Every individual I spoke with professed great pleasure, but not surprise, to see me walking among them. For it appeared as if my perceptible instantiation within this dream reality was predictable. As if everyone expected me to appear within this abstract eventuality. Even more oddly, notwithstanding our unexpectedly youthful appearances, I recognized we were all actually considerably older. Yet as long as we remained and resided in this enigmatic lucid dream house, we unaccountably once more persisted in our youths. For an indeterminate span of time, we interacted with one another throughout the house, with each moment we spoke together coming into sharp focus as tangible as any ultraordinary mundane reality can presumably be, while lazing in an ostensible French manner. So many sundry frivolous dialogues synchronistically transpired within the structure, I found it difficult to focus on any one of them for more than a few seconds. Perhaps because so many men and women sipped red wine from long-stemmed crystal chalices, and soft laughter chimed from room to room, it seemed as if a perpetual party persisted in the house, somehow outside time and space. When I wandered into the kitchen and noticed some of the people busily preparing a meal, I asked one of the women what I could do to help. Brusquely, she ordered me to go up into the attic to fetch a bushel of vegetables from the larder set off to the far right. But after I ascended the stairs leading to the attic and passed through the door, I found myself standing in a chamber vaster than any great hall I could imagine, enclosed under an elevated ceiling braced by broad arches held aloft by oversized columns. As I hurried down its never-ending length looking for the storeroom on my right, I came upon a woman garbed in a full-skirted dress obscured by a correspondingly long apron, as if she were a scullery maid from a bygone era. The threadbare gray linen cap atop her head, fastened by drawstrings tied beneath her chin, sheathed a rat's nest of unkempt salt and pepper tinted hair aimlessly poking out everywhere. Because the woman ran when she saw me, I assumed she must be a squatter living in the attic. As if it was my place to defend this property, for a time I ran after her down the seemingly never-ending succession of hallways, keeping pace, but never catching up with her. I suppose I might have pursued her farther had I not suddenly noticed the larder on my far right, and giving up the chase, stopped to open the door and enter. While examining the chamber packed with floor-to-ceiling shelving filled with foodstuffs of many varieties, I noticed rumpled bedding on the floor in one corner and deduced the woman who ran away from me must have lived in this larder for quite a long time. Then, arbitrarily feeling chastened to have earlier tried to chase her away from her squat, I decided to say nothing to the assembled people downstairs about the woman living in the attic. Next, rummaging through the assortment of supplies for the various vegetables I had been sent to bring to the kitchen, I found a leather bag roughly the size of my fist. And on opening the drawstring binding it tightly closed, I discovered it contained several gold coins. Abruptly, I heard a loud knock on a door beside me, which I had not noticed earlier. And when I opened it, two men dressed in black dusters forced their way into the larder and demanded I give them what I found. Although I still patently held the leather bag of gold coins in my hand, they did not seem to notice it. To coerce me into giving them what I found, they started to press me. But peculiarly, I felt no ill will towards the men for their over-aggressive behavior. Then for a time, more to test my ability than to taunt the men, leaving the larder I repeatedly dashed a distance away at an inconceivably fast speed, then waited for them to catch up before sprinting away again. At some point, I put the bag of gold coins into my pocket, after which, I must have run off too fast for them to follow, because my assailants never reappeared. Then, on realizing I stood at the head of the stairs, I left the attic and rejoined the others below. Reaching into my pocket, I removed the leather bag. And then, untying the bindings, I removed 2 coins and examined them in the light. Both seemed made of stone, but I instinctively knew they were gold. And while the markings appeared indecipherable in an unknown archaic language I did not understand, I discerned that one coin was dated 1523. Suddenly, the room in which I stood morphed into an ornate dining refectory, more apropos to a French palace. And as people entered to eat, they took seats around the large table placed before an ancient medieval tapestry. As some people carried in platters of food and set them down on the serving board along the side wall, I was able to focus introspectively on what was transpiring. Sitting at the table, focusing on what was happening around me, I discovered I could paranormally extend my consciousness into literally every room of the house. And as I began concentrating on the happenings in the other rooms in the large edifice, everyone began to wander off when the dining room and the table morphed into a series of unrecognizable and distorted shapes. So, left alone and feeling no apprehension at the rift of aberrancies transmogrifying reality all around me, I projected my consciousness from one room to the next, and saw others manipulating reality as well. Something unseen in the house was allowing each of the inhabitants to manifest whatever actualities their insatiable hearts rapaciously desired. But whereas some individuals yearn to instantiate sensual manifestations with the reality-warping power imposed upon the unsubstantiated veracity of the dream, others tried to manifest ominously darker acts and deeds. In a circular room at the front of the house, 2 men and a woman dressed in long trailing black robes laced with blood-red borders and hems villainously chanted an incantation around a pentagram in order to materialize a god to grant them unlimited power over material reality. Reluctantly knowing I had to intercede to prevent these oblivious novitiates from instantiating a reality radically beyond their severely limited comprehension to control, I willed my corporeal body to stream along the filament of my extenuated consciousness through the house and into the chamber where the misplaced magics transpired. But before I bodily manifested in the room, the god abruptly materialized inside the pentagram sketched in blood. The man and the woman who called him forth could no more hold the immensity of the god's true being than a gnat could swallow an elephant whole. And as soon as they uttered his name, they all winked out of existence as if they never existed in the first place. When the god left the room to reconnoiter his environs, stunned by what I witnessed, my consciousness unexpectedly snapped back into my loitering body, which only managed to travel as far as the foyer adjacent to the lateral hallway at the front of the house, bordered by a succession of low buttressing arches extending ahead towards the pentagram chamber. Only 20 feet away I saw the massive bulk of the god rocking back and forth, perhaps because the arches impeded his enormous size, confused about how to enter the foyer where I stood. With a bulbous head, much too large for the muscular body supporting it, the humanoid being seemed to lack the omniscience to fathom how to duck under the low arches to exit the hallway and reach me. But then, as if he perceived the solution from my thoughts, the god dropped down on all fours, and wedging his swollen head between the columns crawled beneath an arch. And before I could think of what to do, or for that matter even move, the monstrous being rose to its feet and ominously loomed 12 feet tall above me. As a god, he expected me to fear him, and bellowed at me to speak his name. And when I remained fearless, he became ever more agitated, and in his angry wrath, he began changing reality around me, successively flashing us into one space-time locality after another, committed to forcing me to my knees to bow and acknowledge my overpowering fear of him. However, when my demeanor continued to be objectively calm, he morphed reality yet again, and we abruptly stood on the streets of a large city where the people around us scurried away in fear. "If you do not name me, I will destroy all the people in this city," the god bellowed, pausing to accord me a moment to comprehend the devastation he would cause if I denied him the fear he claimed as his due. "You fear me now, human?" the god exclaimed as if he knew that this was the only response I might make. "I am afraid I fear you not," I rejoined ambiguously. Instantly, all the people in the city vanished when the god compelled them to recognize him within their midst, and none could withstand the enormity of his presence. "Surely, you now fear the true power of my wrath, so I command you speak my name," he roared angrily. "I fear for the waste of those lives that are no more," I countered. "Yet, I also feel compassion for your pain." The god suddenly slumped in abject defeat, and in a blink, we were in the house foyer once more. The strangest part of my dream now transpired. Perhaps because I did not fear him, the god confided in me the lonesomeness of being an immortal, projecting visions into my mind as if his memories were mine. Alone because no entity could exist within the proximity of his godhood, he wandered through the eternalities attuned to the innumerable concurrent realities equivocating within spacetime, leaving fear and devastation in his wake. As we melded telepathically, he materialized a vertical cliff where the front of the house had once been, and we both matter-of-factly began descending the switchback trail towards a sandy beach far below where heavy surf broke. Empathetically, I commiserated with his plight to be a god, but as I still maintained my position of perceptive objectivity, I did not permit myself to offer him counsel. But as the unending tableaus of the innumerable scenes of the death and destruction he caused in untold realities over immeasurable eons passed through my recollection, I abruptly realized none of it was materially real. I knew without a doubt that people materialized into being in his reality to fulfill the event of his passing, but I also grasped his victims had no span of existence outside that single instantiation. Horrified, I wondered aghast if his was a more compassionate reality than mine, because my consciousness tolerated populaces of human beings to exist and persist within aberrant existentialities rife with pain, suffering and poverty, while being fully cognizant of the ostensible hopelessness of their unsolicited plight. Which is truly worse, I conjectured, for this god to manifest and destroy people without self-awareness and recollections, or for me to allow the people I manifest in my reality to suffer long enough to develop a conscious awareness of the hopelessness I cast them in as players. The god finally left me after saying he hoped to find a village he could ravage on the beach below. As I stood there abysmally alone, I absently reached into my pocket and touched the bag of gold coins still there. Reminded by the clarity of my lucid dream, I once more removed a single coin to examine it. And as I remembered the markings on the coin were in a language unknown to me, I wakened in bed. Half asleep and half awake, I reiterated the details of my dream, and then compelled myself completely awake to reiterate the details yet again. Only then did I rise to transcribe the odd sensations of this strange dream while they yet lingered in my ephemeral recollections. St. Augustine's letter about dreams and death. I could go to great lengths to explain why lucid dreams provide a valid view of consciousness, but St. Augustine did that in a letter scribed in AD 415, in which he related 2 lucid dreams experienced by a friend. The below excerpt taken from his letter relates these dreams. I will narrate briefly, however, one fact, which I commend to your meditation. You know our brother Gennadius, a physician, known to almost everyone, and very dear to us, who now lives at Carthage, and was in other years eminent as a medical practitioner at Rome. You know him as a man of religious character and very great benevolence, actively compassionate and liberal in his care of the poor. Nevertheless, even he, when still a young man and most zealous in these charitable acts, had sometimes, as he himself told me, doubts as to whether there was any life after death. Forasmuch, therefore, as God would not in any wise forsake a man so merciful in his disposition and conduct, there appeared to him in his sleep a youth of remarkable appearance and commanding presence, who said to him, "Follow me." And upon following him, he came to a city where he began to hear on the right hand sounds of a melody so exquisitely sweet, as to surpass anything he ever heard. When he inquired what it was, his guide said, "It is the hymn of the blessed and the holy." What he reported himself to have seen on the left hand escapes my remembrance. And when he awakened, the vision vanished, and he thought of it as only a dream. But on a second night, the very same youth appeared to Gennadius, and asked him whether he recognized him. To which he answered that he knew him well without the slightest uncertainty. Accordingly, he asked Gennadius where he had become acquainted with him. There also his memory failed him not. As to the proper reply, he narrated the whole vision, and the hymns of the saints, which under his guidance he had been led to hear, with all the readiness natural to recollection of some very recent experience. On this, the youth inquired whether it was in sleep or when awake that he had seen what he had just narrated. And Gennadius answered, "In sleep." The youth said, "You remember it well. It is true that you saw these things in sleep, but I would have you know that even now you are seeing in sleep." Hearing this, Gennadius was persuaded of its truth, and in his reply declared that he believed it. Then his teacher said, "Where is your body now?" He answered, "In my bed." "Do you know," said the youth, "that the eyes in this body of yours are now bound and closed, and at rest, and that with these eyes you are seeing nothing?" He answered, "I know it." "What, then, are these eyes with which you see me?" The youth said. And he, unable to know what to answer to this, was silent. And while he hesitated, the youth unfolded to him what he was endeavoring to teach him by these questions, and forthwith said, "While you are asleep and lying on your bed, these eyes of your body are unemployed and doing nothing. And yet, you have eyes with which you behold me, and enjoy this vision, so, after your death, while your bodily eyes shall be wholly inactive, there shall be in you a life by which you shall still live, and a faculty of perception by which you still perceive. Beware, therefore, after this, of harboring doubts as to whether the life of man shall continue after death." This believer says that by this means all doubts as to this matter were removed from him. By whom was he taught this, but by the merciful providential care of God? Some may say that by my narrative I have not solved, but only complicated the question. However, while it is free to everyone to believe or disbelieve these statements, every man has his own consciousness as a teacher by whose help he may apply himself to this most profound question. Every day man wakes, and sleeps, and thinks. Let any man, hence, answer now whence proceed these things, which, while not material bodies, do nevertheless resemble the forms, properties, and motions of material bodies. Let him answer this if he can. But if he cannot do this, why is he in such haste to pronounce a definite opinion on things, which occur very rarely or are beyond the range of his experience, when he is unable to explain matters of daily and perpetual observation. For my part, although I am unable to explain how those semblances of material bodies without any real body are produced, I may say with the same certainty with which I know that these things are not produced by the body, I could know by what means those things are perceived, which are occasionally seen by the spirit, and are supposed to be seen by the bodily senses. Or by what distinctive marks we may know the visions of men who have been misguided by delusion or, most commonly, by impiety. Since the examples of such visions closely resembling the visions of pious and holy men are so numerous, that if I wished to quote them, time, rather than abundance of examples, would fail me. The end.